a very special occasion and involves a lot of thinking and reflecting with the different curators. Earlier last year, we learned about an exhibition that was being organized by our very esteemed curator, Senior Curator of Architecture and Design, Paola Antonelli, titled "This is for Everyone, Design Experiments for the Common Good," a subject that we found very inspiring as well as the works contained in it. And we were very excited by the opportunity to develop a MoMA studio dedicated to it. As you may know, This is for Everyone features various design objects that, in Paola's own words, often constitute humble masterpieces, which may include software, electronic devices, and other design objects that have a variety of democratic applications and are meant to improve and change our everyday lives for the good. Over the next month, MoMA Studio will be featuring many of the great works conceived by these innovative designers included in the exhibition, and we will be offering conversations, workshops with many of them, and especially Friday night social hours where you will get to meet some of these great designers. You might be able to find some information about the upcoming programs in the program notes that you have, and a website, a blog that contains the information about what to attend. I really want to thank Paola and Michelle Fisher, her curatorial assistant in this great exhibition, who very generously worked with us in a very collaboration, in a wonderful collaboration to develop the project, sharing thoughts, ideas, things that we could make happen at the space. I also want to thank my colleague Wendy Woon, Deputy Director of Education, who really inspired us and helped us in the process, as well as my colleagues, especially Jess Van Nostrand, who is Assistant of Exhibition Programs and Gallery Initiatives, and Sarah Kennedy, Associate Educator for Public and Studio Programs, who did an incredible job assembling research and working with many of the designers in the show to present the various activities and workshops that we will be offering as part of MoMA Studio. I'm also grateful to Alithia Rockwell and Veena Vijayakumar, who have been key support in our team in putting these programs together, and of course our colleague Shital Prajapati, Assistant Director of Learning and Artist Initiatives, who has been a leading force in organizing our Friday social programs, which we really encourage you to come and experience. It's going to be a wonderful series of events, which we are launching tonight with this conversation connected to design and the common good, which include designers Marta Gutman, Laura Kurgan, and Raphael Sperry, whose bios are also in the program notes, so I'm not going to read them for you now. But thank you so much for being here. Look forward to this conversation. Please join us for the reception afterward. And without any further ado, I leave you with Paola Antonelli. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Jess, Sarah, and Michelle, for helping put together this wonderful program. And, as Pablo mentioned, tonight is the kickoff for the MoMA Studio, and that guy over there that is also clapping his hands is Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, and we'll get back to him shortly. But, This is for Everyone is the title of the exhibition. Is the sound a little weird? Yeah, right? So that's what we'll do. We'll do the sound like this, and I will not look at notes, and I will be acrobatically using the clicker and the microphone like this. Yeah, I know. It's acrobatic indeed. So This is for Everyone is the title of the exhibition that Michelle and I organized. It's a collection show, and it is on display until the end of January. It really puts together many different topics and many different objects. And it asks the question, are all these objects, whether humble, experimental, arrogant, visionary, are they really for everyone the way design should be? Well, it's a question that we really have to ask ourselves. And some of the designers that are in the display and in the collection will be here to help the MoMA Studio through, and in particular, Jessica Rosenkrantz from Nervous System, who was one of the designers of that wonderful 4D printed dress, Yuri Suzuki, who has already started today with a phantasmagoric studio, who is a sound artist and thinkerer. Then there will be a wonderful workshop using Arduino with Juan Cortez, and the regular little bits workshops that we always hold. So this is for everyone, but is it really for everyone? And it's something that every designer should ask herself. And it's something that every person in the world for whom design was made should counter and give feedback about. The title of the show comes from a tweet that Tim Berners-Lee sent at the opening of the London Olympics in 2011. This is for everyone. He was talking about the internet. He was trying to remind everybody that the internet should be open to everyone and it should be left free. But this is a motto that can be applied to so many other common good items and so many other common good value. They should be for everyone. The idea that design should be for everyone is not new at all. William Morris in the 1880s was saying, I do not want for a few any more than education for a few or freedom for a few. Design should be for everyone, education should be for everyone, and design has been trying to communicate this idea of universality throughout the centuries, for those who think that design has existed for centuries, or throughout the 2 centuries past, for those who think it was born after the Industrial Revolution. And then we go to Walter Gropius reflecting on the founding of the Bauhaus. He said, our guiding principle was that design is neither an intellectual nor a material affair, but simply an integral part of the stuff of life, necessary for everyone in a civilized society. And I would add, in any kind of society, whatever civilization means. Design exists for good and for bad, and we'll see what that means later. Moving from the 19s to the 1920s, we have an example with Charlotte Perriand. After all, design is about responding to the gestures of the human being. So in some cases, it's transported to the gestures and to the movement and to the physicality of human beings. While after the digital revolution, we know that it's expanded even more into the digital realm. In the 1950s, Russell Wright said, I believe with religious intensity that good design is for everyone. Now, interestingly, this kind of statement kind of condenses the ideas that are at the basis of the Museum of Modern Art's design collection, and that we are challenging today because good, common good, and good design have changed so much. But still, at that particular time, in that particular center of gravity of the idea of good design, we also could see that beauty was a matter of common good. Not only functionality and availability and access, also beauty. Elegance was a form of respect. That's something that I still believe today, but beauty has changed, and we could say that it's aesthetic intention. It's not anymore the symmetrical prettiness of yesteryear. Above all, good design must primarily serve people. This is Thomas J. Watson, the CEO of IBM in the 1960s. So the idea that also industrial design was for everyone, that is carried through by so many companies. And MoMA has been covering also corporate design, not anymore in recent years because it's become a little heated, but in the past we used to have exhibitions about Brown and Chemex and about IBM, and really show how even companies, enlightened companies, were supporting the idea of design for everyone and of good design. Truth is, this is not yet for everyone, because to this day, actually in 2014, 60% of the world's population did not have the internet yet. And when you don't have the internet these days, you don't have access to power in many cases. There are examples, for instance, in Africa of clever leapfrogging using wireless network and telephone networks, but still to this day, the internet represents one mode of access to the powers that be and to power, distributed power. We know that both Google and Facebook have been trying to put together consortia of different companies. One is internet.org, the one initiated by Facebook, and instead Project Loon initiated by Google, and they try to distribute the internet around the world using drones or using balloons. There are many projects of that kind because that seems to be one of the ultimate way to give access to everyone, give access to knowledge and to and also to riches, to the ability to enrich oneself both intellectually and also financially. But is it really for everyone? We're trying to reach a common good, but how many times do we really achieve it? Well, the Museum of Modern Art has been trying to think of this idea of common good, as Pablo reminded, with this extended notion of humble masterpiece. I mean, it's a term that I coined in 2004, but in truth, it's something that goes back to the very beginning of the museum. And I called it humble masterpieces because we were putting together an exhibition of very humble objects in galleries in Queens in the middle of all the Picassos and the Gauguins. So those were the big masterpieces, and instead the paper clip and the post-it note were the humble but still masterpieces they were. And the idea that design was a way for everyone, no matter the social or financial background, to have art in their lives is something that was at the beginning of the museum. It was what Alfred Barr, the founding director, thought that design should do. Common good today pervades so many of the different worlds that are also in the digital realm. And you see here that there are two ways to think about, for instance, open source. This is the Good Design Open Source, the iWriter project, a group of hackers, engineers, and artists coming together to help a graffiti artist affected by Lou Gehrig disease and developing a new solution, completely open source, available to everyone, for people that are paralyzed to write using their eyes and their eyeballs. So it's become something available to the whole world for a cost that is an absolute fraction of similar systems that are now for sale. But at the same time, open source also means the 3D printed gun. So on the one hand, open source is for everyone and leads to a positive outcome. On the other hand, it enables everyone to have the means to print a lethal gun at home. And it's interesting when design for the common good starts hitting these kind of moral ambiguities. When we were installing This Is For Everyone, Michelle and I also were in the middle of this project called Design and Violence. For a year and a half, every week we published a different object that had an ambiguous relationship with violence, and we asked experts, two of them are here tonight, while one of the designers of one of the objects is also here tonight, so the three exhaust completely the team, and we asked experts to comment on them. And interestingly, we always tried to find objects that had this ambiguous relationship that could be seen as for the common good, but at the same time also going against that particular grain, from targets to comments and artworks about gentrification. So there were all sorts of examples of possible violence. And the 3D printed gun also led to a debate, a great debate, in which Cody Wilson, the designer of the 3D printed gun, argued one motion and Rob Walker argued the against motion. And the motion was not about gun control, it was about open source. So it's important to be cognizant of the fact that even the common good is not an absolute value anymore. And today there are new discoveries, technological and design discoveries and developments that can be used for good and for bad, that are double-edged sword. You see here a virus that has been developed using software developed by Autodesk that we acquired into the collection last June. The virus is the bacteriophage that has been one of the war horses for so many biologists for so many decades, but now it can be designed really fast with software, and it can be used to deliver targeted cancer medications without destroying the circumstancing tissues. Or it can also be used to hack the president's DNA, as the designer, the scientist that concocted it also pointed out. So once again, it could go either way. And it's important to know that as a designer, same thing as a scientist, you are putting in the world something that has the double power, that is a double-edged sword. Victor Papanek, one of the biggest thinkers of design in the 1970s, wrote that industrial design has put murder on a mass production basis. He also was telling everyone that industrial design is a very dangerous profession, something that so many of us had never thought about, because we think the opposite. We think that design is for the common good. We think, like Thomas Watson Jr., thought that it is for everyone. But in the text of the exhibition, we have written, as we revel in this abundant possibility that it is for everyone, we sometimes forget that new technologies are not inherently democratic. And from initial exploratory experiments to complex and often contested hybrid digital analog states, all the way to universal designs, the exhibition explores questions around design and intention with works from MoMA's collection that celebrate the promise and occasional flip side of contemporary design. The flip side is something that we must remember. What should designers look forward to? What should they take as a goal, as a holy grail? The Hippocratic Oath or the Human Rights Declaration? What should we aspire to and measure ourselves against? Well, hopefully our three speakers will tell us tonight. A very easy way to put it. Our three speakers are in order of appearance. You have the bios on your brochure, so I'm not going to go into details, but Laura Kurgan, Marta Gutman, and Raphael Sperry. And I got to tell you, they were each other's pupils. I won't tell you in which sequence, but they all studied with each other or under each other, which is quite fascinating. And tonight, they will bring one example each of design for the common good or design that highlights the ambiguity of notions of common good that have changed. We'll start with Laura Kurgan. They will talk about the $1 Million Blocks, which is a wonderful project that is in the MoMA collection. We will then have Marta Gutman talk about a really interesting public school here in New York that is completely blind to the outside world. And last but not least, we will have Raphael that will talk about prison and isolation. And I would like to invite first Laura Kurgan. Thank you very much, Laura. Please come.
No, I'm going to use my computer, actually. Oops. Is it working? Is it going to appear on the screen?
Never.
Yeah.
It's not. You're gonna have to describe it from scratch. No, we never have technical glitches usually. What's going on?
It was working before. It'll be fine. Oh. What do I need to do?
It was on when you walked up there.
What?
It was on when you walked up there. What did you do,
What?
Laura?
Let's see.
What did I do?
I don't know. We'll try resetting that.
There.
We can all go to the second floor and see it there.
No, I have a few surprises there.
Huh?
I've got a few surprises.
I know. No, it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, that's right. Marta was reminding us of the blown light bulb in the carousel projector. Yeah, that was another classic. What is
Yeah,
it?
we can do it. Yeah. That's fine. Okay, that's fine. All right.
I think we can go with the main computer.
Yeah. All right.
Should come up in a second.
That's Michelle, by the way. Yahoo!
Okay. All right. So now this I'm gonna have to use. So this clicker is gonna click. This goes. Which one goes forward? Huh?
10 seconds, let's count. 10, 9, 8. There you go. All right.
Oh, so it's working. It's working from my computer. Okay, excellent. Okay, all right. So Paola, thank you so much for the invitation and for it's actually really amazing. Since the $1 Million Blocks arrived at the Museum of Modern Art in 2008 to design in the Elastic Mind, it has been on display in this museum ever since, and I'm hugely appreciative of that. And nobody should tell you that the Museum of Modern Art is an elitist institution, because you have no idea the number of emails I get about this show from the public programs that come through the museum. I could give a whole lecture about that one day. It would be really interesting for your department. So anyway, so I'm Laura Kurgan. I've been running this thing called the Spatial Information Design Lab, which is going to morph very soon into something called the Center for Spatial Research. And we've been given a big grant, and the thematic topic of my next 4 years of work is going to be around conflict urbanism, which is very much part of the $1 Million Blocks project as well. That conflict, is not something that is only about war, but it's actually endemic to urbanism, and that cities, most importantly, are not only destroyed but also built through conflict. And I'm going to talk in many ways about various situations of that. So just very quickly, the first project of this new center is about Aleppo. We're doing a platform which documents a lot of different layers of what's going on in Aleppo right now. This will be launched at the beginning of December. We're also installing something at COP21 in Paris in the Palais de Tokyo, which is a project about migration and climate change, where the end of the update is very much focused on Syria. And then this is a brand new project, which I would love to spend more time on, but I won't. But it's a grid of the nuclear power plants all over the world. There happen to be about 643 of them, and when you look at them on Google Earth, it's really interesting that some of them are blurred, some of them are blacked out, but there's ways of finding them by going to OpenStreetMaps and seeing somebody has actually drawn where it is, etc. So we're doing a whole project about that, and also visualizing the populations at risk around the within a certain mileage of the facility. So, architecture and justice. This is the talk I always give. I've given it many times. I hope those of you in the audience who have seen it before will tolerate it. But what I'm going to do tonight is actually talk about the trajectory of the $1 Million Blocks project, because I never quite gave it up. And in fact, I'm working right now with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and we're looking at 16 NYCHA sites across the city, so I don't have any of that to show, but we're working with them. Talking about, is this for everyone? The thing I'm most proud about this project is that the same graphics, the same visualization, the same message can be viewed in a museum, it can be viewed in a public policy meeting, it can be viewed by school kids. It really is a project that has managed to talk across audiences, and it's not something I've managed to do very often. So there was something right about the way that this project worked. So the idea, the city is not simply a collection of people and buildings, but a network of relationships. Information is constantly exchanged. And this circle is something that I constantly repeat in many of the projects that I do. You can start anywhere on the circle, but data is designed. Design has an effect on policy, the built environment, people, etc. So as we all know, and we've come to read about a lot in the news lately, and it was not in the news when I started doing this project, so that's a big change. That prison population is one of the highest prison populations in the world. These two graphs show, the top one shows the vicissitudes of crime over time. There are highs and lows according to all kinds of reasons, whereas prison populations just go up and are still actually going up. So public housing in the United States currently shelters approximately 3 million people in 1.3 million households. So incarceration and public housing have a lot in common, and I'm going to try and unpack that a little bit today. So this is how we start the project. Here's data as individuals. We look at these kinds of lists, and instead of looking at the crime that people have committed, we look at their home address. When you put that data in geographic context and align it with political things like census blocks, you see that incarceration is very concentrated in highly specific neighborhoods. So this is a map of prison admissions, and this is crime, which is much more dispersed across the city. So crime geographies lead to crime prevention tactics, and what we're trying to encourage are community investment strategies, especially because these prison geographies, again, you've been reading about it a lot in the papers lately and on the news, are very intersected with poverty and with race. So this is people of color in Brooklyn. These are people living below the poverty line, and this is people admitted to prison. So when you add that up block by block, it adds up to a lot of money. And when you start zooming out first and you connect the lines of where people are in prison, their home address with where they are incarcerated, which is upstate New York, which will link to some of the things that Raphael will talk about later, you notice that the money is all going outside of the city. When you start to zoom in, and this is Brownsville, Brooklyn, you notice a very disproportionate amount of the population is being admitted to prison compared to how much percent of the population there are. So zooming in over here, these are people, this is how much it costs to incarcerate them, this is where they live, and we call those $1 million blocks. So on a financial scale, the prison is becoming the predominant governing institution in the neighborhood, and the money goes elsewhere. So the question that we asked at the end of this exhibit is, would the city look different if the money were spent differently? So we've done all kinds of things, had scenario planning workshops. We've worked with on the ground with the Brownsville Partnership and are still working with them. We've set up all kinds of institutions and organizations which don't ordinarily work together, make them work together because they're all dealing with incarcerated populations. We did 3 years of work in New Orleans, which is actually a really good story. We focused on this area called Aretha Castle Haley Boulevard. We're looking at a very disinvested part of New Orleans, which used to be full of Black entrepreneurs. And it was really an area that was being revitalized by all these not-for-profit organizations. The same type of thing, got all these organizations trying to work together with a common population, and started asking this question, right? Should we be investing in an exostructure of prisons, cycling people back and forth from their neighborhoods to prison, or should we be reinvesting and dealing with the actual populations and investing in a different way? So at the same time, questions were being asked. What, 5 more minutes? Yeah. Okay. People were predicting rises in prison populations, and we were trying to have this hypothetical graph of how do you get prison populations to go down, okay? At the same time, public housing was being brutally demolished, and that's what you see over there. That's the housing project that's just been demolished right across the highway, and it's very unusual. In a city, there is a prison inside of, there's a difference between a prison and a jail, right? So this is a prison inside of the city. And outside of the planning process, which was a very public planning process in New Orleans, there was this prison being developed by FEMA saying, we need 7,000 beds. There used to be 6,000 beds, now you need 7,500 beds. And we somehow found this plan, and it became part of a big activist project in New Orleans, and I will be very happy to tell you that this succeeded, not by me, by myself, but an incredible range of activists who demanded that this prison should not be expanded. And in fact, its current size is for 1,400 beds, not the 7,000 beds that had been planned. You build prisons and you fill them, right? So if you want to reduce the prison population, you need to reduce prisons. You need to make them smaller, or you need to demolish them. And this is where I'm going to take you next, okay? We worked with the Department of Probation in New York. Same type of thing. Probation populations all come from the same 7 neighborhoods. Probationers, when you're sentenced to probation, you are not sent to prison, right? You have to go and report to an officer and try to get out of going to prison, but you sit in places like this and are not treated like a human being. So I'm not going to go through that too much, but we did manage to completely redesign these 15 probation places, and I did not design those, but they are much more welcoming places, and we did all of them. Now, this is this year, State of the Union Address, Obama. Okay, this is what's called a steam graph, and Simon Rogers was trying to find out what people were tweeting at what points of the speech, right? And Obama did mention, he said, we have different takes on events of Ferguson and New York. We surely can understand a father who fears his son can't walk home without being harassed. Surely we can understand the wife who won't rest until the police officer she married walked through the front door. Surely we can agree it's a good thing that for the first time in 40 years, the crime rate and incarceration rates have come down together, and that we use that as a starting point for Democrats and Republicans. It is really a Democrat-Republican thing. So what we were doing at the same time is we were collecting data from at Black Lives Matter. And if you notice what's trending over here, foreign policy, public safety, cybersecurity, right, that really have much of a relation to this Ferguson event. And so we realized that kind of hidden in this database, because we were searching through Black Lives Matter, was this anxiety, like, why isn't Obama saying enough about it? Is it Black Lives Matter or is it all lives matter? So this is just a very small piece of actually what gets hidden from a lot of these trending topics. And next day, this was at Columbia, that was for a big panel on We Can't Breathe and responding to what had happened in Staten Island. The next day, Hillary Clinton arrives and she says, it's time for us to change our approach. The end of the era of mass incarceration. We need true debate, right now. Most people don't know that it was actually Bill Clinton 20 years ago that started the mass incarceration that has taken place over the last 20 years. He invested $9.85 billion in prison building in small towns across America. And he invested $8.8 billion in the police, in increasing the police. He also invested $395 million in demolishing housing projects as part of the Hope 6. He did not start the Hope 6, but he really escalated it. And so 110,000 housing units have. Okay, so again, Hillary Clinton, and I'm a Democrat, okay? I vote Democratic all the time. Without the mass incarceration that we currently practice, millions fewer people would be living in poverty. Bill, it's time to take a clear-eyed look at what worked and what didn't, what produced unintended, long-lasting consequences. He went so far as to say, I signed a bill that made the problem worse, and I admit it. So my question, and I think it's a question that I want to bring up for debate when the three of us talk together, is why are we so willing to demolish housing and not prisons, which in effect became a kind of a mass housing for the last 20 years, right? So there's a lot of people talking about retrofitting prisons. And I really want to know, why are we talking about retrofitting prisons, retrofitting schools, and we're so willing to demolish public housing? There's something weird in this kind of conundrum. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, you got it? Yeah, I don't want the second mic to fall.
Thank you. So thank you, Paola. Thank you, Michelle, Sarah, for inviting me. And also, I need to give due thanks to the Educating Harlem Project, which is where this study has originated. And I am now speaking as a historian. And I will read my talk. As my students know, many of whom are in the audience, if I don't read, we'll spend the whole time on the first picture. So faced with intransigent bureaucracy, poor schools, very few playgrounds, and entrenched racial segregation, Harlem parents demanded direct control over the core functions of public education during the 1960s. When one school became a flashpoint in the battle for community control, this one, IS 201. Now, it's the infamous windowless middle school that abuts the railroad viaduct in East Harlem. Parents organized a boycott in the fall of 1966, determined that the school would not open until their demands were met. And as calls for Black power and racial separatism supplanted those for racial integration, the white principal resigned, and the growing tension fueled conflict that led to the citywide teachers' strike in 1968. Historians argue that the strike changed New York City politics, erasing support for integrated public schools. This evening, I want to direct our attention to architecture. Everyone goes to school, but was this school designed for everyone? Absolutely not, according to Preston Wilcox, the radical sociologist and community organizer. White architects and politicians, including Mayor Lindsay, may have rallied to defend what one journalist called Harlem's besieged masterpiece. But to Wilcox, this school symbolized, and I quote, the worst in community planning and public education. The architecture has soothed the guilt of the Board of Education. It has failed to handle the legitimate anger of the ghetto. So to frame my thinking about space and politics, I've turned to the sociologist and political philosopher Henri Lefebvre. And the story of this school, I contend, illustrates his claim that space is made through how it is built, lived, and imagined, and that citizens win rights to the city through struggles in real time and real space. Appropriating urban space is emancipatory in a democracy, according to Lefebvre. And he also cautioned that appropriated spaces are likely to replicate the power relations of the dominant society. Since IS 201 was designed to diffuse demands for desegregation and what is called an equalization school historically, it is proof positive of the gap between the community's vision of local involvement in education and the board's rigid stratified top-down management. And when frustration pushed the community further toward activism and the Ford Foundation funded an experiment in community control, parents, teachers, and staff formed a governing board and took over the school. They appropriated it in Lefebvre's terms. And they made it a place for radical experimentation, including and especially for the children whom you see in these images. All involved learned that they had taken the first step in what would prove a heated fight and continuing fight for justice and liberation. So, contractors broke ground in 1964 for an air-conditioned school that cost about $5 million to build and that doubled as an air raid shelter. It was the most expensive school built in New York City history up to that point and the first one to be fully air-conditioned. Lifted one story above grade and without one window in any classroom, the new school provoked immediate outrage. Parents called it a tomb on stilts, a prison, a warehouse, and a fortress. Now, if you take a close look at the rendering, which is by the architects Curtis and Davis, you'll see Black kids inside the fenced playground and white kids on the sidewalk. So this drawing echoes serious charges from parents that the school board intended the school to be racially segregated and that the school was made windowless so that parents couldn't look in and see racial segregation in operation.
So where did the architectural idea originate? Immediately, we face the question of evidence because so much of it has disappeared, and disappeared is a generous term. I believe so much of it has been destroyed. So the model survived thanks to Lily Crowder, this architect who worked for the Board of Education and the first Black woman to be hired as such. The working drawings are in the municipal archives, but I have yet to find a document that explains why white architects from New Orleans were hired to design a school in Harlem. So as their practice grew in the late 1950s, Curtis and Davis set up a branch office in New York City. They were looking for work. And controversy touched the firm again and again, many stories to tell there. But in 1960, it was well regarded, including for these innovative schools. And in their design for IS 201, the architects called on lessons learned in New Orleans as they satisfied the strict requirements for a junior high school in New York City. Classrooms for 1,800 students, an auditorium, a cafeteria, a gym, and a playground. Now, the small site proved an intractable problem given the designer's preference for a low-slung freestanding building. This is what made the school an equalization school. So I suspect that the 1961 zoning resolution, the one that made the setback tower and plaza ubiquitous in Midtown, inspired the solution. So the architects set the school back from Madison Avenue, placed the auditorium and the gymnasium, which are shaded in red on the plan, above the covered plaza, and regrettably, this forced the classrooms to be placed close to the railroad tracks. So enter the windowless solution, favored by the pedagogy people at the Board of Education and the Educational Facilities Laboratories, the research arm of the Ford Foundation, because it allowed flexibility in classroom use. A windowless school also promised to mitigate noise and pollution from the railroad and to reduce maintenance costs. Vandalism had caused window replacement in city schools to skyrocket in the 1960s, and so of course the answer was, rather than to figure out what was causing the kids to break the windows, was to take the windows out. And the Office of Civil Defense preferred a windowless school because it could be used as an air raid shelter at no additional cost, when shelter features were inherent in the design, as they were in this one. And such was the case at IS 201, and another windowless school in Brooklyn, also designed by Curtis and Davis. Now, IS 201 does in fact have windows. It has windows on the ground floor to light offices, and upstairs at the end of each corridor, which are also now shaded in red on this plan. And the perforated brick screens that you see in the photo render the glazing invisible from the street, and they also have the added function of masking the mechanical system air intakes. It's a very complicated way of getting air into the building that almost defies the imagination. So it's important to recognize that this is not a sleek steel and glass building, but rather one that shows the burgeoning disaffection with high modernism. Curtis and Davis tried to offer due deference to community history and place by cladding the concrete frame building in brick and alluding to classical African and Native American architecture with tapered columns and beams, a hypostyle hall, arcades, and what I take to be Kiva-inspired seating in the playground. One or few of those still exist. However, the emotional and psychological needs of Harlem children didn't enter into the discussion until it became time to promote the school to a public already dubious about its merits. And Curtis and Davis, at the behest of the Board of Education, put together this brochure to explain the design rationale and answer questions like these. Why is your school up in the air? What makes rooms for thought? How does your classroom grow? How does the air conditioning work? And in each case, the sketches emphasized protection, containment, and separation, and underscored the assumption that a child needed to be removed from the world outside of the school if the child was to learn. And this sketch, titled How You Can See the World, is the most troubling for reasons that should be apparent and that I think Raphael's will call on imagery that we'll see in Raphael's presentation. So to a thinker like Lefebvre, abstract spaces endemic in the mass-produced buildings of modern society diminish what he called and what he valued, affective, bodily lived experience. And this diminution, this reduction, has grave consequences. It does not permit a continual back and forth, one that is needed by all members of society to forge the consensus that confers upon them the status of subjects. So if we look at IS 201 through this lens of abstract space, it's clear that the physical spaces of the school cast children as objects, not subjects. So we could stop here, right, with this picture, but only if we presume that the relations between an architectural setting and larger worlds are fixed at the time of construction, and they aren't. So the physical character of the windowless school provoked the governing board to do better, to make the school into what the feminist Bell Hooks calls a site of radical openness. And as she reminds us, places on the margins of places like this school can incubate creative challenges to hegemonic social orders. And so a top priority for the governing board was to eradicate egregious and ingrained patterns of institutional racism in New York City public schools. There were no black teachers, there were no black principals, and so it hired teachers, staff, and administrators of color, including the acting principal, Ron Evans. His tenure was controversial, but he worked with colleagues to model leadership, to integrate Black and African studies into the curriculum, and in other ways to experiment with pedagogy, including with the elementary schools that were affiliated with this middle school. And another priority was to promote the broader cause of Black power and to link schools, politics, and pedagogy with political autonomy for Blacks. Architecture helped because the state-of-the-art school contained amenities that were unheard of in other Harlem schools. And in this beautiful auditorium, Herman Ferguson delivered his incendiary tribute to his mentor and friend, Malcolm X, in February of 1968 in an assembly attended by children, teachers, James Baldwin, and Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's widow. And in that lecture, he basically issued a call for Harlem residents to arm themselves with guns. He was fired. Yet another cause was education in the arts. Curtis and Davis expected a windowless school would enhance a child's artistic imagination, but teachers knew better. They offered classes in dance, music, and theater when no other Harlem school did so. They took students outside to draw and paint and displayed artwork in parks and playgrounds. The school published catalogs, included artwork in yearbooks, and convinced the Museum of Natural History to exhibit student work in 1971. So I don't deny that IS 201, what Wilcox called a monument to absentee decision-making, remains an enduring emblem of the violence that design can cause to everyday people and everyday communities. But following Lefebvre's point that spaces are constructed and appropriated, there's no single story to tell about the school. I submit that in the school, parents, teachers, and yes, children of color engaged in the back and forth that made them subjects, not merely the objects of a technocratic racist determinism. And in this process, they made the school belong to them. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. There you are. Remy? Hi, everybody. Thanks, Paola. It's really nice to be here, and it's an honor to be here. Thanks, MoMA. There we go. Oh, I got to go back. There we are. Good. So, I really want to focus on tonight's theme of design for the common good and whether this is for everyone. I'm going to talk specifically about supermax prisons. We were asked to take a case study approach, so I'm going to focus on what I think is the most infamous supermax prison in the United States, which is California's Pelican Bay. So supermax is a term for a prison within the larger prison system. Here you can see both parts. The lower part of these gray bow tie-shaped buildings are a conventional California maximum security prison housing unit. And then up here, this whitish X-shaped building is the supermax. And supermax functions towards the rest of the prison as a prison functions towards society as a whole, which is to say it's where you're going to go if you misbehave. So supermax is really the logical endpoint of the deterrent principle of incarceration itself. And this is the recent logic of American deterrence, which Laura also talked about, massive prison expansion. 1 in 100 American adults is now behind bars. So you could say prison is for everyone because we have so much space in prison. But actually, prison's not for everyone. It's for poor people, people with substance abuse problems, people with little to no education, mental illness, and especially people of color. And in contrast, high status privileged professions like architecture, which are nominally open to everyone, in actuality are reserved overwhelmingly for white people, especially for white men, myself included. So how does prison design and supermax kind of fit into this? American mass incarceration is built on the narrative of being tough on crime and waging a war on drugs. And in this war, we've got cops, courts, and prisons are the weapons, and the toughest weapon, short of the execution chamber, is supermax, solitary isolation. It's not an idle threat. There's about 80,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States on any given day. And as far as design goes, the supermax is a prison that's designed for prolonged solitary confinement to prevent human contact and any kind of interaction. Most architecture focuses on designing spaces for positive social interactions. The AIA talks about architecture being a profession that makes spaces for people to live, work, and play together. Supermax is an anti-architecture that aims to erase communal life. Psychologists observe that when it does this, it irretrievably damages the individual psyche. It produces hallucinations, depression, self-mutilation, and suicide. So that can be the outcome of design. The way that this isolation is designed starts with planning where buildings are located. Pelican Bay, not unusually, is in the remote, heavily forested northwestern corner of California. It's over a 7-hour drive from the San Francisco Bay Area and over 12 hours from greater Los Angeles, which is where most of the prisoners there come from. The distance and the associated cost of travel to visit loved ones breaks down family and community connections. The pods are the basic unit of the prison. People in custody are legally allowed a minimum of 1 hour of outdoor time 5 days per week and a shower 3 times per week. The pod structure provides this in isolation and no more. Yard time, that's outdoor time, occurs during daylit hours, and in winters that's only 8 hours a day, so there's 8 cells. Each cell gets access to the yard through the pod hallway for 1 hour per day through remotely controlled motorized doors, 20 minutes for shower time. So, oops. See, you go out here, through there, and back in, then the next guy goes. When it's operating as designed, no human contact is required to meet the legal minimum standards for out-of-cell time or for hygiene. And this is what counts as outside in Supermax. It's a concrete pit, or a dog run, as people who've actually been there tend to call it. It's about 3 times larger than a cell. Until the hunger strikes at Pelican Bay in 2013, the yards were completely bare. Now, because of concessions after the strike, they've got a pull-up bar, and you get a handball during rec time. So one yard and 8 cells. The cells are 4 each on 2 levels, make up a pod, and 6 pods make up a cluster. Oops. There we go, there's a cluster. This is the logic of cost-effective surveillance and fear. The center of each T-shaped cluster is an upper-level control room where 1 or more guards can supervise 48 cells without leaving their secure enclosure. The clusters are arranged back to back and side to side to make 4 corridors radiating out from the central access point. The corridor is another key control element, divided into 2 levels by metal mesh flooring. Only guards can travel in the upper level, which gives access to the control rooms. Guards don't carry weapons in spaces where they might come in contact with prisoners, so that the weapons can't get taken. So when prisoners are in the lower hallway, they're escorted by unarmed guards, but there's an armed guard with a rifle who shadows them on the metal flooring above, who can shoot down through the open flooring. And for the same reason, the control rooms have open bar grating on the front side, so that the lines of sight that for observing prisoners at all times can also become lines of fire at a moment's notice. The men held in Pelican Bay, it is all for men. They spend 23 hours per day and all weekend in their cells. Because the psychological stress of isolation is so severe, cell occupants can be expected to behave violently, attacking the building and themselves. The hardened design of the cell and its all-concrete furniture anticipates this, but it's a perverse design. Instead of taking measures to alleviate the stress that drives people to such self-destructive behavior, the environment's hardened to protect the building, which in turn increases the isolation and sensory deprivation that create that stress. Acoustics are a particularly stressful aspect of prison environments, and Pelican Bay is no exception. Basically, 100% of surfaces are composed of concrete, painted steel, or stainless steel. The cell measures 7'4" between the walls, 8'8" from the edge of the bunk to the door, plus the 3-foot bunk, and 7'7" in ceiling height. The cell doors are a key feature of the pods. The perforated metal dividers allow for daylight to enter the front of the cells from the front, eliminating the cost and the risk of providing windows in the cells, because the skylights over the pod hallway function together with the doors to bring daylight into the cells to reach legal minimum standards. The perforated metal also allows for observing nearly 100% of the cell without having to enter it or approach it too closely. You can have a conversation through the cell door without opening it, although many people who are inside complain that it gives them headaches to stand near the perforated surface and look at people close up. This letter over here that a prisoner in Texas I correspond with sent me is against the background of a rubbing of the perforations on the metal door that he was behind when he was sent to isolation. And then the doors have a pass-through slot that allows for the delivery of meals, medicine, and mail without requiring human contact. It functions like a bank teller's tray with a box that's inside the cell where you can put things in it and push them through. When prisoners are escorted out of their cell, it also serves as a place to handcuff them before they're allowed to leave. So the designers of the door filed for a patent because it solves so many security and design problems simultaneously with all these different innovations. And certainly it's a design innovation, but to me this brings us back to the question of the evening. Is this for everyone? It might be obvious by now, but there's no healing here, no attempt to address the root causes of crime in society or of disorder within prisons. This is not designed for everyone. Design seems only to have enhanced punishment and suffering in this case. The human rights community, from Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch to the UN, are in agreement that supermax prisons and other forms of solitary confinement currently practiced in the United States are human rights violations. However, U.S. courts only enforce constitutional rights, including a prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, whereas the human rights standards prohibit the broader category of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Human rights were intended to be universal. Human rights were for everyone, but Americans only get the subset of rights within the Constitution. So we often think of human rights as negative, as prohibitions, no killing, no torture, but there are positive requirements in them too, which are quite inspiring. Of note to designers, people have human rights to housing, education and medical care, and cultural participation. The thoughtful design of affordable housing, of schools, and clinics is a necessary component of realizing human rights around the globe. Human rights also require that people in prison be treated with dignity and respect. So let's look at one last feature of Supermax, the treatment module, which are these boxes. Variations on this metal mesh phone booth type box are used for individual and group therapy and for classroom instruction. This was supposed to be an improvement in conditions because people in Supermax were previously not given any treatment. Group activity was basically eliminated, and there was very little medical treatment as well. Or they did it through the cell doors with no privacy. So the treatment module would be a great design innovation, except that it falls short of the human dignity standard by placing people in cages like they're zoo animals. For design to be for everyone, it must start with treating everyone as a human being. Great. The basic argument about the need for being tough on crime is the same rationale as the need for supermax prisons. We have to respond to crime and transgression with force to deter it. If we do not show that we will use all possible force, we encourage violators to overpower us. In this logic, there's no room for negotiation, for recognizing any common ground with the other. This is why human rights are so routinely ignored inside prisons. They presuppose a commonality that's already been rejected. The repeated failure of the tough on crime approach is basically the same. It's not an evidence-based policy preference, but a moral insistence on punishment to the exclusion of everything else. So while everyone who participates in the system must weigh whether that public policy is acceptable to them as a citizen, as a worker, as a policymaker, or so on, designers take on a special responsibility when our work literally embodies the system. Is this design for the common good? Does brutalizing a despised minority keep the majority safe? Does selectively opting out of the international human rights system strengthen American values? It's encouraging that the American Institute of Architects Code of Ethics calls unequivocally for support of human rights. Human rights, after all, are for everyone, and AIA's code is supposed to demonstrate the architectural profession's commitment to public health, safety, and well-being. Architects, designers, and planners for social responsibility, the organization I lead, has spent over 2 years petitioning AIA to strengthen their human rights standard by barring AIA members from intentionally violating human rights. But AIA has not yet implemented our proposal, in part because of opposition from the AIA New York City chapter. However, over time, AIA, along with other design professions and the broader society, will get the message, and the commitment to human rights will grow, just as has happened for accessibility and other universal goals. If we want to pursue the dream of universality, of design for everyone, then we must recognize, I'd say, that some objects, like supermax prisons, should never be designed for anyone. I'd like to suggest that human rights, with a similarly universal goal, are a uniquely valuable point of reference for where to draw that line. Thank you.
Laura here, we're going to put Raphael here, we're going to put Marta here, and I'll sit here. Yeah, just completely done at random. This was quite an amazing series of presentations. For anyone who thinks that design is cute chairs and fast cars, this was a pretty good way to correct the record. Amazing, amazing presentations. Thank you so much. First of all, Raphael, can you please say why AIA New York is against this? I just want to understand. I mean, you're just like...
At the meeting I attended with them, one of their members said it was a risk to their business.
In New York.
Hugely lucrative design.
Prison
Why
design
New
is
York?
Prison design is about half the firms in the country are AIA firms, and the ones that do what they call justice architecture, which is prisons and courthouses, many of them are in New York, and they don't want to lose business to non-AIA firms.
So interesting. Well, it's clear that people who design supermax prisons have a certain position, and they are unambiguous about what they're doing. But Marta, what do you think the architects from New Orleans, the white architects from New Orleans, meant? What was their intention? Were they thinking of the common good, or do you think they were perverse? I mean, you've studied it so in depth, and you're an architect. You must have a sense in your stomach of what animated them.
I've tried to give some positive spin on this, right, in thinking that there was some interest in rethinking glassbox architecture in light of the kinds of deference paid to criticisms raised of high modernism by Team 10. But I can't get much farther than that. I think that Curtis and Davis were looking to set up a practice in New York City. I think it was completely driven by pragmatism and practice building. They wanted to set up an office in New York. They came looking for hotel work, which they also did. These are the architects who designed the Superdome in New Orleans, and they are also the architects who designed the American Embassy in Saigon. So they have a really complicated and interesting history, and all of the records concerning the commission for this building are gone. They're gone from the archive they're expunged. They're gone from the archive in New Orleans, and they're gone from the archive in the New York City in the municipal archive. So there's no job file, what we call in architecture, to track the decisions. And there are other complicated reasons for the ways in which the governance of the Board of Education changed too, that eradicated records, particularly in 1961. So there's a lot of supposition here. But I know they came to New York. I know the person they sent to open the New York office hooked up with people in the AIA, New York chapter, who were really eager to explore ideas offered by the EFL, which the Ford Foundation was funding, and this idea of windowless schools was very appealing. So there were windowless schools, and the idea appealed because of the maintenance question, because of beginning concerns about energy consumption, and because there was, by detaching a classroom from a window, one could rearrange the interior partitions of a classroom more easily. So it's all connected, and it took about 8 years for the
So interesting, this idea of efficiency.
efficiency.
Almost
yeah.
like,
And then I think also that the board was very eager to build a very high Board of Education, a high-end, well-designed, well-built school, which this is, with all kinds of facilities that other schools didn't have, as a way of diffusing demands for integration.
But it was
Yeah.
incendiary because
It was
also
incendiary.
a perception.
Incendiary.
Raphael, you were trying to say something.
Well, I was going to say, this is not the only school that looks like a prison. When I talk about prison design, many people, especially students, have asked me, why is it that so many schools look more and more like prisons? And they're not talking about schools from 1965. They're talking about schools that they went to in the past 10, 15 years.
And a
Which
lot
leads
of the
me-
same architects design schools and prisons.
That's
yeah.
Yeah,
interesting.
well, and I
Well,
think Foucault would say it's kind of, they're both disciplinary institutions, so there's a similar
Yeah,
logic.
the way they're conceived from the beginning. You had that question. It's not about schools. It's about housing versus prisons. But why don't you ask the question again? Because it was so nice of you to actually prepare the question to the audience. The one we were talking about demolishing. Yeah.
Why is it that people are so willing to demolish housing projects and not demolish prisons and schools, actually? So schools are often retrofitted, and they're failing schools just stand their ground, and every 10 years there's a new philosophy of education, and people come and rip out, and then they go from large schools to small schools, and then they decide, no, schools are no good, we really need to pay
Charter
the
schools
teachers
within.
and charter schools, yeah. But that's the question, because you don't hear so much about the policy behind the mass prison building. What do you call it? Program, right? Program which was designed to save shrinking towns, which were suffering from globalization and the effects of the U.S. economy. And now we're left with these prisons, and nobody ever says, let's demolish the prisons. Why? We should demolish the prisons.
Marta, you wanted to say something?
Well, I'm not so willing to give up on schools, with all due deference to Mr. Foucault. I think that, in 1850 or so, Mark Twain said, and he wasn't making a joke, that every time you build a school, every time you build a prison, you kill a school. I mean, and in the 1880, late 1870s, Kate Douglas Wiggin, the inventor of the free kindergarten movement, or one of the advocates of it in the United States, active in San Francisco, said, we build reform schools, we build prisons, we build industrial schools. Why don't we educate children? And I think we can't give up on the cause of education. We can't just say that to build a school is to build a prison. That's too easy for me.
I didn't mean to say that at all. I think we agree.
I think that's a.
I think
really
the comment that schools today look like prisons is a commentary on the school-to-prison pipeline, and the fact that kids feel like even when they're being sent to school, if kids in poor black neighborhoods especially feel like their school is preparing them to go to prison in a number of ways, including even in the physical environment, but
And
also
the
in
mesh
the
and the windows.
Yeah.
And the security, as you
Yeah,
and
exactly.
the metal
Yeah.
detector
Yeah,
and so
which
on.
is-
Right. No, but I think you're absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think the experiments for schools were very different than the experiment of the supermax prison.
Exactly.
That
The intentions
the
were
intentions were good, and the windowless schools often, in the research I've done, there's often the utopian idea of technology, TV as a window, and the control, air conditioning, and all of that, and the
think some of
flexible
it-
classrooms. It was.
I think race is also a factor in all of this. I mean, why we're not building public housing anymore? When public housing was created, it was for white returning veterans from the Second World War, when there was a huge housing shortage. And then once it became primarily for people of color, it was like, oh, well, we don't really need to support that anymore.
This is another
now we can demolish it.
huge,
Now we're gonna,
huge
the towns
topic.
that prisons
Yeah.
are saving are towns that are populated by
people.
rural white
Yeah.
voters who
Right.
politicians want to keep on their side. But then they're stocked with the people from from ghetto neighborhoods, and the willingness to experiment on school children with new designs is usually practiced more on on poor kids and on kids who are black and brown rather than on white kids, no?
I want to open up a little bit to the audience. Sorry, you were about to answer this. I want to, because this is such a great opportunity to discuss matters that we all care about. So do you have questions for our speakers? Anybody that, there's a question high up. Oh, can I say it?
Yes, I'd like to ask Marta Gutman a question.
Hi, Mom.
This is
Yes,
Marta's
I would ask
mom.
her
I mean,
this at home,
yay.
but I could ask it here. You point out how the teachers reused the space and brought the children outside.
Right.
Was there ever any attempt to redesign the building itself so that the
None.
teachers could do what they wanted to do?
There was no attempt ever made. No,
No.
none.
And not by the community, and not by the teachers, and not
No.
by any, was it ever
I mean,
raised?
the demonstration district, as you know, you lived through this, the demonstration district closed very quickly. It was diffused by the state government, politicized. There were 3 demonstration districts, one in East Harlem, one in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, which is where the strike started, and then one in Lower Manhattan. And it was a totally tempestuous, highly charged time. And the general thought among historians on the left is that the decision to diffuse the experiment in community control was one that was intended to diffuse black people and poor people of power. And I think they're completely correct. And the school...
And the school stands as it is.
The school stands as it is, and the
No
school
windows.
is...
They didn't put any windows in.
There were no windows ever added, and the school is now, and this is, you know, to cite Paola's phrase of design violence, it is now used as, it is divided into 4 smaller schools within one building, and in the basement, in the cellar, is located one of the most feared detention centers for teenagers in the city. So the school to prison pipeline works very well here, and is there's sobering lessons that are tied up with the building, yeah. But my point is my point about in studying this place, which has become a kind of obsession with me, is that it is too easy just to stop at the architecture, right? To stop and say that this is a place where only oppression happened, because in fact, that didn't happen. It was a place that because it was so powerful in the spatial imaginary of the Harlem community, became a site that inspired and incited organizing that went on to have all kinds of ramifications elsewhere in Harlem in the 1970s. It all started here is the phrase that's often used in relationship to this particular school.
So maybe the interesting thing is that the school was polarizing, something got sparked from it, and instead of prison becomes like a black hole and dark matter, nothing can stem from it. But yeah, you know, so it, from a perverse viewpoint, architects could find the school a beautiful building, you know, those who admire brutalism, and at the same time the community is completely offended by it. So a debate happens.
Excuse me, but the architects did. It won a chapter award in 1966,
Yeah.
right? So it's the AIA comes up in this quite a bit, right? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Anybody
Whitney
from the
Young-
AIA here?
I think Curtis and Davis also designed prisons too. So this would, yeah, I'm obsessed with them.
More questions. So we have one over here, and then I'll come there. So one here, and then we'll get to you, and we'll get to you.
Hi. I was really interested by the Victor Papanek quote you put up at the beginning, and then again seeing Raphael's proposal to add this new article to the qualifications of not designing these immoral things. And I'm also noticing a lot more things, like Tristan Harris is this guy from Google who's going around telling UI designers that they can't design anything that takes too much time. And then there's also people, I've also seeing a lot of graphic designers who are saying, you know, we should not be willing to, you know, design these really poorly intended marketing campaigns. And I think it's interesting that you started with the Victor Papanek quote, because at the time, it's just way too early for people to listen to what he's saying. And I'm wondering if, in your opinions, you think the design community is more mature than it was at that time to actually take these suggestions more seriously than the sort of radical comments that Papanek made at his time.
Do you think the design community is more mature today, more self-critical, more self-aware?
I think parts of it definitely parts of it are, but I mean the architecture firms designing these kinds of buildings they design buildings.
I think the community, like any population, the architecture community, the design community is reproducing itself over time. So younger people are coming in and older people are leaving. And if the younger people are coming in more mature or more aware of these issues than the previous generation of young people, the field will have made some progress. But I'm not sure how much that's happened since the 1970s. I mean, maybe a little. I think we probably gained some ground. I feel like in the past 10 years, people, like Laura was saying, awareness of prison as a big issue has become more widespread. And I think the idea of kind of public interest design is something that a lot of young people are bringing with them into the field. So hopefully that's a little bit of maturation. But I know Marta and I were talking before. You were one of the founding members of ADPSR in New York City in 1980. So the organization that I'm now the president of, Architects, Designers, and Planners for Social Responsibility, was founded in 1981 around the issue of nuclear disarmament, which felt like a big crisis then. It was.
It was a huge
crisis. In the same way that I think it's some...
It still is.
Well, I agree. Yeah. We still work on that, but also in the way that kind of the social injustice of mass incarceration is reaching a similar proportion.
Right. So I agree with you. Right.
So have we made progress?
I think we've made progress because we're talking about this at the Museum of Modern Art. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Good answer. You're sorry.
How were schools like Washington Irving and the Snyder schools developed in New York City, which are gems of schools, and then we deteriorate to having pedestrian buildings that we have now? What difference? I mean, I don't think we made progress. The Washington Irving is such a beautiful school. A kid walking in there would feel privileged, would feel
Marta?
wonderful. And yet,
So how is it possible?
Well, this just raises the word of politics, right?
I guess so.
Yeah, there was a constituency for public education in the turn of the century, which does not exist now. I teach at City University, and let me tell you, there's no constituency for public education, none. Not politically. There's a constituency in the city and a constituency among the people of the city, but politicians we don't fund public education. And there's a great chart. I thought you were going to use it in your presentation that was developed in California when there's a great big line.
Oh, I do use that one. I just only had 12 minutes.
I know. Well, I can't hold the mic and describe it, but it's this big red X, right, that shows reverse curve, funding for schools, drops, funding for prison goes up, and you just track the funding, right? So if architecture firms are designing the two together, I don't think Snyder ever designed prisons. He was too busy making schools, but the funding cycle is deeply tied, right? And my point, and I started in housing, and housing is my passion, but my point is that if we could flip that chart, right, and take the money that goes to prisons and put it in schools, we wouldn't need to be building prisons. We would be redressing a great wrong. And the people in Harlem understood that. They knew that. They knew that their kids needed good schools.
Right, no, but the question is why did it happen in the first place? Why the fight on Clinton's whole program? Why did all these it's very hard to turn it's very hard to flip that around.
Right.
And I think there's lots of conversation now about reducing mass incarceration. It really does feel like there is a move afoot to change that. But what exactly, that's my question, what exactly is going to change? The money, I don't know where the money is going to go. Not necessarily into schools. It's going to go into redesigning those buildings. And that's where I think the problem is, because when you think of it as a problem of what do you do with the prison buildings, it's the wrong way of asking the question.
There was another question over there on the
Who was
Can I say
asking?
one more thing?
Oh,
on that?
sure, of course.
I just would also say that the argument, when I say politics, I mean it, and that I mean politics in a much bigger sense than what we're talking about right now, and that not that there isn't politics in these design problems. There's huge political questions, but the larger argument that's being offered by this kind of new generation of African American urban historians, Donna Murch, Nate Connolly, Michelle Alexander, they're saying, their argument is that the reason that prison construction started and incarceration began in the way that it did, that the law changed and the buildings followed, they see the parallels with Reconstruction are absolutely existent, that there is a decision made or an attitude put in place after the great freedom struggles succeed in the 1960s, but that black people are going to be put in jail as a way of diffusing the movement for black liberation and freedom. And the parallel to Reconstruction is strong, and I think there is a lot of merit in that argument. To change that idea, architects need to think politically in a much bigger way than architects are generally willing to do.
And it really seems like the human rights is a better paragon than the Hippocratic Oath, as Raphael was saying. Where's the question? Yeah. It was answered? Okay. Any other questions on? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Speaking directly to what you just said, why is there such a I don't know if apathy is the word, but I feel like designers in general, to speak very broadly, are afraid of politicizing their work or speaking about policy or speaking about these very real issues. And why do you think that is, and what can we do? Is it something coming from design schools? Is it coming from these organizations? Like what tangibly can we do to address that apathy?
Well, I think that's yeah, it's a big challenge, and I think a lot of it has to do with the market structure of the American economy and the way people are forced to, when you're young, sell your labor to a larger firm, and then once you become more senior, seek after clients who in the private sector have a tremendous amount of discretion about who they're going to hire. There's I mean, part of the reason that AIA, I think there was more than just not wanting to compete with AIA firms. Other AIA members who didn't like the proposal we had said, why would we want our professional organization to do anything potentially irritating to our biggest client sector, which is government, and tell them we won't build, the 1% of buildings that we find odious,
I would like to ask
there's
about
a lot of fear of clients. It's very stifling for designers, and unfortunately, the market is being advanced as a kind of model for more and more of human behavior, but it makes everyone behave very competitively and frankly act out of a lot of fear if you're not somebody who has enough wealth in order to free yourself from market forces.
Let's talk for a moment about the apathy, not only of architects, but of the world at large. Laura, you work a lot in ways to point out, to clarify, and to really put in front of people's eyes data that might remain hidden by the fact that figures can't be read that easily. So do you feel that visualization design can really shake the apathy of the world at large? Have you seen it happen with the $1 million blocks? With the architecture and justice, definitely.
Yeah, that was one example. I mean, and it brings up what you brought up at the beginning, that data can work for and against an issue. So the $1 million blocks can be used equally by people who say neighborhoods breed criminals as the ones who say money should be spent differently. So I'm often in that world of very murky world, and that's why I'm always so critical of the modes in which you have to very responsibly use data. But to answer your question, I do think that architecture schools are obliged. I teach this way. I don't teach building design in a vacuum, and I think using visualization and mapping and analyzing the city in new ways should be able to enable us to ask new questions. And that's the most important thing. And I think our students, they're not all walking away starting to work in big architecture firms anymore. There's all kinds of, right? Our students are doing a lot of
There's so many ways to be an architect these days.
Right.
Okay, she wants Melissa to ask. Melissa is the last question. Yeah, go for it. Make it count.
Thank you three for your research and for sharing that with us. I guess my question is for Laura about your proposal. I guess your statement about retrofitting versus demolishing. I was wondering if you have an idea or maybe a proposal for the future about public housing. I know that like in our studies of public housing, we've seen the negatives, I guess, or the failures in public housing. So would you see retrofitting maybe public housing as a solution for the future, or because you kind of said, I guess the demolishing was something that you were against?
Well, because the way because public housing is demolished with the particular programs that have been put in place, there's never the same amount of public housing that was built as there was, and so and so the units are reduced, and then public housing just gets diminished. So I don't have an answer, but it's just for me it's a provocation. Why are governments and people so willing to demolish housing projects and not to demolish failing schools and prisons? You know, I think schools are retrofitted constantly with change. It's actually a really interesting phenomenon. Every 10 years, you know, there's a new theory of what's going to fix schools in poor neighborhoods, and foundations pour money into retrofitting. I was part of some of these projects, millions and millions of dollars. Right? Is that the right way to spend the money? I just like to ask the question in a different way. I don't have a single answer. I'm certainly not the person that's going to provide that answer, but it comes out of collaborations between architects, policymakers, psychologists. It doesn't come out of a single building type. Can you imagine the thought that went into designing those supermax prisons? That's really scary meetings. Yeah.
Reminds Gideon, reminds mechanization to his commander. Do you want to say something? No. Well, because I want to bring this part of the conversation to a close, but we're going to continue outside with drinks. But I have to say, housing, prisons, schools, they are three typologies that are at the basis of society for good and for bad, that in different parts of the world are used and perceived and also constructed in different ways. I mean, we see prisons elsewhere are almost, to American eyes, almost ridiculously inviting, you know, like the Norwegian, exactly, the famous Norwegian prison. So everything is a double-edged sword, and even staples of our social life, as these three typologies, can really veer in directions that sometimes are expected and other times are unexpected. And I think this really leads us to try and redefine our position as designers and architects towards the common good. And I hope that these three amazing speakers with their three incredible case studies, I mean it, really are going to leave you with many more questions than you had before. And if you are designers or architects, you will position yourselves in front of your projects in a different way. And if you are not, you will remember that what we do as designers and architects is for you, and ultimately people, everyone, are the judges of architecture and design. So thank you very, very much, Marta, Laura, Raphael. Thank you for coming. Let's go outside and have a drink together. Thank you.